It's been a fabulous day. I thought it was going to be a great big nostalgia fest, but in fact there's been a lot of extremely good, cool analysis and some, quite negative opinions about a number of things that happened with the arising from the Learning Age document. And I liked the confetti analogy, but I would also like to think that in fact there is another analogy about all of the things that were happening, which was letting 1,000 flowers bloom. And the Centre for Social Exclusion at the London School of Economics, who did a massive review of New Labour's anti-poverty policies, had a wonderful statement. They said many things were tried and a lot worked. And I think that was also true of those years that followed the Green Paper. I've got another rather gloomier quote, which I rather like, which is that David Putnam once said, "The future looks increasingly like a war between our failed past and the possibility of a far more imaginative future." And you could turn that round and say, it sometimes feels like the opposite, that we are in the middle of a war between a more imaginative past and a failed future. I hope that's not going to be true, but certainly it was an imaginative past. I've got two major points that I want to make. I mean, we heard a lot today about the run-up to the 1997 Green Paper and all the policy that had been developed before it. But I would want to say that 1997, the Green Paper in 1997 was different. It was different. And it was because lifelong learning was being promoted in the context of a bold and ambitious wider social policy framework which sought to create a more equal society. And that the economic case for lifelong learning was linked to a social case in a way that it never had been before and actually hasn't been since. And it was also underpinned by a belief that change could be achieved by a big, strong direction from the top. Now, that had its downside, as we saw, but I think that today we wouldn't make quite the same comprehensive vision that David Blunkett made, but I think there is a real case for us to have one, and I think Tom's lifelong learning report of 2009-2010 with the life stages is a really good way into that, but we could talk about that another time. The second point that I wanted to dwell on was the point which I've headed, delivery matters. And some of it is based upon my experience, again, in the New Labour years, when I was an advisor to the Prime Minister's delivery unit. And I would really like to commend those years for the focus on delivery. I'm not saying that they got it right, and Alan was horrified I was there and horrified with all the targets and all of those kinds of things, but there was a definite question in government of how do we make this happen and how do we create integrated strategies across Whitehall. I mean, lifelong learning wasn't in the priorities of the delivering unit, basic skills was, but they, at the very least, is what I like, is that there was an overarching model for how do you make things change. I mean, the model was wrong. It was far too target-driven. It was far too top-down. But there was serious thought going on in government. We have these ambitions. We have these ideals. How do we make them change? And John Prescott actually said, engaged in that work, this is what I came into politics for. How do we learn to make things change? I think New Labour got it wrong in many ways, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But this context of delivery matters, I think, is massively absent in the current government structure that we have today, and it's a very serious deficit. I now work in mental health, and the government has delivered innumerable speeches and innumerable strategies for mental health in the last few years. And the constant problem that we have working in mental health is none of that is actually coming through. The system is too complex. Things for the aspirations to actually be delivered on. And that serious look at how you can deliver those aspirations is what we need. And that's actually what people have been doing here today. We've been looking at that and saying, well, they got it right in that bit and they didn't get it right in that bit. And that is so important. And we actually need leaders who understand that. And I think we currently have leaders who don't really understand that. My third point on that was that and again, this is something that's been referred to a lot today. In those years, I was chair of a learning partnership. And to me, that was an exemplar of how absolutely not to do things. They were decreed on top that we should all set up learning partnerships as a means of promoting provider collaboration and maximising the contribution of lifelong learning to the local areas. And so, again, it was done in that you must do list. I just want to say to you that we were told we had to work alongside local strategic partnerships, Learning and Skills Council regional offices, regional government offices, regional chambers, regional assemblies, regional development agencies. The list could go on. And it was a shambles. And that is my second point. And again, that was made today very well, I think, in Martin Yarnett's group, or Martin Yarnett made it, that, okay, have that strong vision and direction from the top, but don't try and direct everything from the top. And that, I think, was a big mistake that emerged from the learning age. Very, very quickly, just to echo one of the points that David Blunkett just made, we don't have an overarching radical approach to social change or lifelong learning and horizon, but we aren't in a policy-free landscape at the moment. The government's industrial strategy is the big shaping document, and there is a clear recognition within that document that place-based strategies are needed. Adult education budgets are going to be devolved to mayoral areas. Growth priorities are going to be determined locally. There will be local industrial strategies. There will be a Transforming Cities Fund, a national retraining service which will be developed in partnerships locally. And I think that that is a place where we can come in to try and shape the future along some of the lines that we're talking about. And then the next point I want to make is there are a number of areas that really hit the government's buttons. The first is mental health. The second is social mobility. I hope a third will come on the horizon, which will be the needs of an ageing population. It's unbelievable to me that it isn't. But all of those have got massive potential for us moving forward to the future. And I'd finally want to tell you all, if you don't already know this, you probably do, that there was a government foresight report on the future of skills and lifelong learning before Christmas that said to the government they needed to formulate a comprehensive policy response, that in order to increase participation, they needed to address the underlying factors driving a person's willingness to learn. Where's Lorna? That was the point she was making this morning. And there is a moral argument for lifelong learning. Whether they've read this report or are taking any notice of it, it is there, and it's very important. So in summary, I want to say, let us campaign for a big vision again, for an ambitious, comprehensive lifelong learning strategy and its role in our society. Let us use the massive knowledge that I've seen here today to speak strongly for the right mechanisms for delivery that work from the top down and the bottom up. And thirdly, let us seek to understand and use the current context and the current ambitions and wisely use them to advance our cause.
The most enviable slot of the day. Follow David
Okay.
and that.
He
Follow
knows
David
what,
and
he knows
that.
what to do.
I just
On you
heard
go,
Mary
Tom.
say, follow that.
Yes,
she said,
well
yeah.
done, Tom.
Very enviable. No, terrific, actually, Leisha, genuinely. I've got 4 points. So I think I'll score you on numbers of points if on nothing else at all. And those are these. The first is the vision thing, which we've been asked to talk about. David said he thought it was the best thing that he'd written, the foreword, and it did paint out a vision. I just want to ask the question of, in what kinds of terms do we want to express a vision of lifelong learning? I find a sort of ambivalence. I mean, on the one hand, I want it to be resonant, fine rhetoric, stuff that warms the hearts. On the other hand, I'm also a materialist, and I need an underpinning of something that says this is what's got to change. So I think in terms of base and superstructure, if you like, what is it behind the vision that would really carry us into a learning society? And that's why I do think that issues around resources and the spread of resources is really important, and somehow to be able to build that into a vision in a concrete way is really significant. So, you know, it's absolutely yes to having the rhetorical, I mean that in a positive sense, the rhetorical terms, but actually we need to hook those absolutely into something that says, if we're serious about this, it's got to mean changes, not in a zero-sum context, but there are going to be probably some losers in this game. So that's point one. The second is about the ownership of the vision. And actually this links very closely with quite a lot of what Leisha said. I remember raising at a session where, I think it was the RSA, unless it was you, Alan, who brought together 3 former secretaries of state. David was one, David Willits was second, and Vince Cable was the third. Now these are all powerful, intelligent, determined men who genuinely, I think all in slightly different ways, but genuinely believed in lifelong learning. And none of them made the impact that we might have hoped for. And I sort of raised a question at that session, which I phrased wrongly, and so it was interpreted just as if it was about departmental structures as to why it hadn't happened. But it is an issue that continues to, I wouldn't say obsess me, but I mean, it preoccupies me. So we had David talking about education and employment and trying to keep those together, and that makes sense in one respect. But we know that a lot of the issues surrounding lifelong learning go beyond education and employment put together. Mental health is an increasing issue. To take only one example, we also know the army was mentioned, major area of adult learning, so HM forces. So the obvious solution then is to say, well, it's got to be a cabinet office or a total government responsibility. But, and the people who are far more experienced than I in thinking about these things, if you make it so broad, it ain't probably going to work somehow. And I think there's a tough question for those of us, is who do we see as owning the vision and with responsibility for driving it? Is it a single force, or is it maybe a more limited number of government departments, but ones that really can work together? So, you know, pick your 3 sectors that you think are going to be the driving force to take it forward. Okay, there'll be some losers in that, but it seems to me that is an important challenge. That raises within it the question of what level, so it's not just a top-down operation. I'd say the patchwork, the devolution issues that we have facing us seem to be really, I think, catastrophic. I mean, we've got half of the budget's being devolved to these 9 areas. The rest of the country is going to be filled in on what seems to me an extraordinarily sort of random dartboard effect. So there is real difficulty in getting coherence and in getting a balance between the national, the regional, the local areas. And that's something we will have to wrestle with. And I think there are, again, choices for those of us that want to see this driven forward about what level is it going to be taken forward. There's a lot of talk quite trendy talk about place-based, and I really want to know what that actually means in practice. So who owns it is, who should own it, where is it going to be most effectively owned and driven from, remains, I think, a really significant question. The third is the balance between individualism and collectivism. Alan and Tom Wilson and I just published a report, I think there were copies at the back,
Yeah, they got.
on a national learning entitlement, and we put it forward at a seminar earlier this week. And one critique, quite a nicely phrased critique, was that we were sort of following too much down the individual, market-oriented debate. As David was saying, with ILAs being put in terms of vouchers, individual vouchers, which was not his original intent. Now, my answer to that was that in part it's a way of countering the extraordinarily strong vested interests, sectional or sectoral interests, and very powerful institutions, mainly going under the name of universities, that want things to carry on in the way they are. So one way is to try and shift this balance between supply and demand. But I think we need, again, to work out what is the right dynamic and interaction between trying to hand over power to individual learners and potential learners, and yet getting a responsiveness in the part of providers and the big sectors. So, and whether that's communities or the state, or however you interpret the collective element. So it's something I think still there is a scope for good creative action. And then my fourth and last point actually really has emerged from today, in one sense, from the working session that I was in this morning, and that's the issue of targets and how they relate to vision. And Leisha mentioned the delivery unit. Well, and Michael Barber's name has come up. Now, at some point when I was working at OECD, there was a big meeting, and Michael Barber was asked to come over. I think it was even a ministerial meeting, actually, educational ministerial meeting. I happened to, I was a member of the Secretariat, sit behind him. And Michael, who is, I have the highest regard for Michael, just in case you misinterpret any of this, but he is a very sort of thin figure with very cropped hair, and he's he does not have a lot of flesh on him. And I sat behind Michael and I watched him with the ministers sat in this, where he was telling them about targets and red lights and green lights. And I'm afraid I thought of Beria under the Stalin regime, actually sort of directing people out as to what it is that they were going to achieve and what happened to people if they didn't meet, if the light went amber when they were summoned into the Star Chamber. And it was a slight problem with the targets that it created that kind of atmosphere, maybe. Don't know, Leisha knows more about this.
It wasn't right.
It wasn't right. I know, okay, well, it's just my image of him suddenly.
But I think we're in a pretty delivery-free environment.
We are indeed. And I think what the idea that came up that I hope will be taken forward, and I think could have real impact, is on a coherent set of targets, not a single figure target, but for adult learning in our, whether it's by nation or by locality. But a good bit of work could be done quite quickly that could have a huge amount of impact. The targets, and embedded in some account of the process by which targets should be developed, monitored, and implemented. So it's not seen as a sort of top-down operation. Because I think there is a consensus that targets have the potential really to drive things forward, and without them we're drifting slightly, but we need them to be valid and coherent things. And actually, if I could just have a slight plug, I mean, the Learning Through Life did have, the 2009 publication, did have as an appendix towards an intelligence system, and we talked there about indicators and about the processes for measuring progress towards a lifelong learning system. I can see Mary twitching. I have actually finished, but I did want to finish quite genuinely with a real thanks to Alan and his colleagues. I mean, if a bomb fell, God forbid, on what's it called, the Chancellor's Hall,
yes.
It would wipe out a fair amount of the adult learning expertise of the country. And it has been great to listen to people exchanging things. And I hope in some way, without it just being notes on a conference, I think actually, making sure that we have absorbed the lessons and make those lessons available from the last 20 years would be a really valuable exercise.
Thank you very much. Wow. Now, we are going to hear one last comment from Professor Sir Alan.
Well, yes.
And then it's
I
really
really
up to
will
you.
let you go. But I have to tell you that in your pack, there is launched today the University of Wolverhampton's Manifesto for Lifelong Learning, driven from his sickbed by our distinguished Vice-Chancellor. So please have a look at it, because I think what it argues in part is that one answer to one of the things, well, really both of you talked about place in different ways, that the argument that learning cities is significant is one worth exploring. I was in Suwon for the Konfintea midterm. Do you know, everybody in this city in Korea lives within 10 minutes of a library and 20 minutes of a learning centre. What that means is the library is the hairdressers or the coffee shop on the corner, and the kind of corporate commitment that you can get across silos, stunningly difficult at the nation-state level, so much easier when there's local pride and you rub up against people. So I think that's an argument worth looking for. We haven't said enough, I think, about promotion and celebration and making a fuss. We're too quiet. And I do think the entitlement argument is worth exploring. Yes. I always wanted to give people vouchers for the big birthdays. You're entitled to a weekend's adult learning. It would arrive like the Queen's telegrams when you are 40, 50, 60 and 110. And bless you for coming, and have a safe journey home, and thanks very much. And to all my colleagues who've sweated through the day, and especially to the people who made the film watchable in the finish. Thank you.